Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are diving into an area that's making it makes up a strong percentage of practice revenue, but it's also an area that often gets overlooked, and that area would be lens technology. So progressive lenses, task lenses, digital enhancements. The options have really never been greater, but how do we as eye care professionals keep up with all these advancements? So today's guest works inside the world of optical labs, and he's going to bring a behind the scenes perspective on where things are headed. So, welcome to the podcast, Director of Sales for Three Rivers Optical, Phil Cummins.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
It's great to have you here, Phil. Let's start with the big picture view. What are some of the more exciting advancements that you're seeing right now in lens technology?
Yeah, so we're seeing some work around filters, right? So for headache, migraine, traumatic brain injury, those kinds of things. And we're seeing studies at least done on myopia control lenses here, still not released. And those don't come into play nearly as often as where we see probably the most impactful things going on that affect daily practice, and that's around progressive lenses and as you referenced, task lenses, things like that are kind of a daily decision.
So specifically on that, I know that waiting for myopia control. There's some exciting things going on there. You talked about filters, but the old standby progressive lenses, right? They've changed over the years. Um, what have you seen change most over the years that practices should really be aware of?
Yeah, so and the changes have been quick, right? When we made progressives before, we had to engineer a mold, and then there was a long ramp up. So if there was something new in technology, it took some time to to advance that, to build inventory, to market that, to roll it out, where our changes come really, really fast now. If there's an algorithm that can be put into that generator and make an improvement, that happens pretty quickly. Um, and I would say probably the most impactful around a couple different areas. So certainly corridors, more choices in corridors, both the length of them and the inset, where they move in a lens. Um, Power distribution, there's some customization to how specific a progressive can perform, whether it has a bias to a different area. And then of course the task lenses are huge improvement for those of us that sit in front of a computer all day or work indoors most of the time.
Is that still the biggest use you see for what we call task lenses? Because those have been getting a lot more attention as well, especially when doctors start talking about multiple pair sales. We look at that first pair, that sort of everyday wear, but then we start looking into suns and task specific lenses. What type of patients benefit most from these, and how should practices be incorporating them into the conversation that they're having with patients?
Yeah, so the indoor lenses, and we used to consider those a second pair, right? We would have a primary pair, and then a secondary pair would be for the desk or the office, right? And easy to make the argument now that that's your primary pair. If you spend most of your time at work and you work indoors, you could easily make the argument that that's your primary pair of glasses. Those are the ones that are going to serve you best. Still incorporates the same kind of powers that a progressive does, but it's not really a question of power as much as it is posture, right? Where it's located and you know ergonomically how it helps your posture, your movement, things like that during the day. It's just a big improvement in comfort.
You talk about things like power corridors. Single visions are pretty basic, but when we get into those progressives, especially, things get a lot more complex. In the role of, the doctor versus manufacturer versus the lab, who's driving these lens decisions? I want to take a little deeper dive into this area because things do get complex, and I'm not sure even a lot of doctors really understand the intricacies of progressive lenses as much as they could. And sometimes we default that over to the optician, but sometimes they don't even understand it as well as they could. And as you said, things are changing rapidly. So there's a level of understanding and education. But in most cases, do you see who's driving the lens decisions? Is that on the doctor? Is it doctors consulting with a manufacturer? Does the lab weigh in? Maybe this is more driven toward uh, a younger doctor, a newer doctor, or somebody just going into practice. But how are we making sure that we're getting the right lens for the patient?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And there's a couple approaches, a few approaches amongst manufacturers even. So those properties that we discuss, whether it's so we'll pick on one that I would call power distribution, right? So you have the same lens plot, the same design, but throughout that design, you have different features. So it could be more geared towards distance or more geared towards near or a balanced design, those kinds of things. And as far as who's making the decision, um, there are manufacturers that in that same design, they manipulate it according to your ad power. Um, and so um, they have their own design philosophy that as you age, the design should also uh, change with you, right? Um, there's another school of thought that those things are available. So instead of the manufacturer making the decision for the doctor and patient, it's a conversation between the doctor or the optician and the patient about what their visual needs are, what their environment looks like, and then you actually access that technology. So you'd be able to specify what you want and where you want it, what's best going to serve. Um, and then there's a third category where you would use a machine or a VR headset or these types of things and and qualify that choice. So the patient would take an exam or a screening of sorts that would direct you that direction, that would direct you to that design. And so legitimate argument to be made for all three of those, right? There's some folks that don't want that decision all in their hands, and there's some folks that want every little piece of technology available to manipulate.
I just got off right before we started recording this. I recorded a podcast with Ankit Patel, and we were focused on AI and how practices are using AI in for business operations, for hiring, a lot of different areas of the practice, staff training. Are you seeing AI become a part? How much is it penetrating into the world of labs, or is it? Because it seems like the things we're talking about, like how to design the lens, would be right up the alley of something AI would eventually play a large role in.
Yeah, certainly could. From where I sit, what I see more is just database, right? Just history. Um, I mean, we are able to track these things on lenses ordered, how often they're ordered, how popular they are, how often they're remade, what changes are made when they are remade. So it is easy to collect all that data and let it help you make decisions on recommendations that you make, right? So if there's a corridor that seems to be more popular and someone wants, hey, just tell me which one to use. And most of the time, and I've had to get away with it, away from that at some point I can. Um, we're able to give that data just because there's just so much of it. You can imagine all the labs across the
Hmm.
country. Yeah. And we try to remake things as little as possible. So we keep records of those things.
Yeah, which makes sense because nobody wins on a remake,
No.
right? The patients don't want it, the doctors don't want it, the lab doesn't want it. So using data would seem to make sense if it reduces um, the likelihood. You're not going to have 0% remakes, but the closer you can get to that, the better.
Yeah.
Last time we did a little pre-call before we jumped on a week or so ago, and you showed me you just referenced it, a headset that doctors can use for measuring things like eye and head movement. And you showed it to me on Zoom, and it looks like my
Yeah.
kid's Oculus gaming
Yeah.
set. Tell me a little bit more about that. Is it accurate? Are a lot of doctors using it? And do you see that becoming more standard in practices, would it be more of a premium level offering?
Yeah, so listen, we've had measuring devices before, right? That were big towers and cost thousands of dollars to take um, PD and fitting height and things like that. And those evolved into apps pretty quickly, right? So where you could get an iPad with an app on it that could do very similar. And it seems to be we've always had, this wanting to do eye tracking and head movement. Do you turn your eyes more or do you turn your head when a stimulus happens? So it just seems kind of organic that that would shift towards a simpler tool, right? That takes up less room in your office, that's easily accessible, that's affordable. And the VR headsets, I think, do a phenomenal job with that because obviously they can tell not just when you move your eyes, but they can record when you move your head, and they can be interactive, and a lot of fun to play with as well.
Phil, as far as setting expectations for patients, I know when I was practicing, we tried to set the expectations early on about the adaptation period, and most people would get used to it. Some people, right, they loved them right off the bat. Other people put them on. You could see the look on their face, like, I don't know about this. Can't look to the
Yeah.
side. The whole world looks a little fuzzy. Most people would get used to it. But is it still, as far as the conversation goes with the patient, is that still an expectation we should be setting that you should prepare for a certain adoption period? And how has that changed with technology? Is the consumer expectation higher that they don't want that, or is it still safe to tell people that this is going to take a period of time to get used to if you're a first time progressive user?
Yeah, I think adaptation is much simpler than it used to be. And one of those um, one of those features that we see throughout premium progressives are some call it skew deformation, right? So things aren't out of focus, but they're out of shape on the periphery. And then when you look across that lens, it's a feeling of instability, not blurry, but instability. And so a lot of advancements have been made with that. And where you can offset. Maybe I can't make this extreme angle clear, nor would I need to. I'm not going to read or look at that angle, but I can make it the right shape. And so that was always a really big complaint. Um, and to your point earlier, with with creating an expectation and demonstrating what we were speaking about, that VR headset. So one of the programs that I've used, and it has a coach feature, will demonstrate a progressive for you in virtual reality, and it's very realistic. So instead of showing pictures of this might look this way, or we all used to draw, images on a piece of paper for a patient, this will put you in virtual reality. It'll let you look around. It'll ask you to look, at something up and to the right, and then say, by the way, do you notice what this looks like down low now, right? Or look at the steps in reality. Now lower your head and look at the steps again. And that function alone is wonderful because it'll show you, and it's very realistic. It doesn't give you an unrealistic expectation of what a progressive is like to look through.
You're talking about something that the patient could look through as a sort of a preview of what to expect.
Yeah, the headset itself, it's the same as putting on a progressive. It'll
Okay.
recreate that. Yeah.
I would think that'd be an incredibly valuable tool because I don't know. This is one of those things I think trying to explain to patients what to expect. You don't
Yeah.
always know if they're hearing you, or you don't always know if they're understanding what we're saying until you actually put them on. So to have that, maybe build on that for a second because you're in sales. What are some of your maybe best practices if you could put yourself in the position of, let's say, an optician? Doctors too, which sometimes struggle with that conversation with patients who come in just wanting, or maybe it's the perception of patients just wanting what their insurance covers. So when we're talking about upgrades into higher technology, more innovative lenses, any suggestions for doctors or maybe more opticians in terms of having that conversation in a way that's going to get the patient's buy-in?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of understanding where they're coming from first, right? So if they've not worn a progressive, that's an easy conversation, and but if they've worn a progressive, and you're making a change, whether you're upgrading or different manufacturer. Maybe they had coverage that drove them one direction before, and neutralizing an old pair of glasses is critical. So if you didn't make that pair, you need to be able to neutralize what they're wearing, see what the design is, look at the etchings, see how it's adjusted, the pano, the vertex, the wrap angle, and and then have questions around that, right? So I know what the powers are, I know what the design is, I know how it's adjusted. Now, how did this perform for you? And then understanding what they liked and what they didn't like about the previous pair, and doing your best to replicate that if they liked it, or improve on it if they didn't. But I think that's a super critical first step, is to understand what their experience is, and also understand even if you're upgrading them, it's a change. So I used to use a car analogy with people that if you drove a big heavy car, um, and you were used to the brakes, right? And then I got you a new car and the brakes are really good, it's still going to be tough because the brakes are going to feel too sensitive to you, right? But being able to tell people what to expect, I think is, where you are, where you're trying to go, and what you can expect in the adjustment period, uh, you know, gets you ready for success.
That conversation that especially opticians have to have with patients a lot. What I'm hearing from a lot of doctors is that um, it's hard to find good opticians. It's hard to retain good opticians. And there's a gap in that specific area. And it's a very important part of an eye care practice, right? For most practices, they're still generating the majority of their revenue from the optical. So, from a maybe an education standpoint, I don't know if I told you this story or not, but it was probably a year, maybe a year and a half ago. I had the opportunity to ride around with a sales rep from Three Rivers Optical, and it was
Okay.
Sally. She's this
Okay.
used her name, so obviously something good is coming here.
Yeah.
She has a wealth of knowledge, so we had some really good conversations on the drives between offices, and I learned a ton from her. But it was interesting to be on the other side of it because I was always the doctor when a
Yeah.
rep came in, but to walk in with the rep, you tend to see a mix of either, some offices were just embrace her as soon as she walked in,
Yeah.
and Sally, they wanted information from her, and she had an opportunity to sit down and share with them and really educate the team
Yeah.
on new things that you guys were doing, new the things we're talking about, new lens technology. It was really an opportunity. And other offices you would walk into, and I mean, you would see like doctors diving into storage rooms to not have to have a conversation. I thought, well, or it just, staff just kind of looking down when the rep would walk in, and I thought, what a lost opportunity. And I understand that doctors' offices get busy, and sometimes we just don't have time to have those conversations. But anyway, that's my plug for listening to your reps and using them, the good ones. I mean, the rep has to, if you're a rep listening to this, be a good resource too, and
Yeah.
understand when, um, I think there's a tactful way to go about, showing up at offices. But that being said, how do what are the resources out there beyond sales reps? Anything you can suggest as far as staying up to date on a lot of the changes in the technology of lenses, upgrades, materials, things like that?
Yeah. So, and to your point with the reps, um, they are, not only do they understand what we can do in the laboratory and what the manufacturers have, but because they talk to so many people, they're able to bring you local knowledge, right? What's going on in your area, what's going on in your state, what's going on nationally, and how you how you compare to that. And I think those things are as valuable as technical knowledge. Um, as far as getting opticians up to speed, certainly do our part to do that, but that's tough. It's tough to fit into people's schedules. Yeah, there's a lot of online resources, good training programs, good platforms. We continue to look into those kinds of things and try to enhance ours, as does iDoc. Um, but those platforms do a great job. I mean, you can, many of them you can sign on as an administrator. You can assign certain, you know, portions to your staff. You can see when they do it. There's a test following it. So you can help people along and you can see progress. And I think those are great because they're done at your convenience, right? Um, I like those platforms a lot. And then if something doesn't seed well in a platform like that, then you can visit with things, that are gaps in person.
Yeah, it's a great point too that they work with so many other practices locally. One of the most common questions I get from doctors is what are other doctors doing?
Yeah.
And I've come to realize how much they value learning what other people are doing that's allowing them to be successful.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great use of the reps who are working with other doctors. Just ask that question. Hey, you work with a lot of offices. What are they doing successful to sell this product, to sell this service? And you'll probably get some really good feedback based on that. Because both sides want to win. The rep wants you to sell more products, so it's a win-win. Um, Phil, I'm curious what maybe we'll just kind of close out here with the role of Three Rivers Optical. What role does the lab play in practices staying current on these issues? Because a lot of things that you're talking about are born right out of a lab out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So how do you work with members on the maybe the educational side and making sure that they're up to speed on some of these changes?
Yeah. The reps in our sales team, they're somewhat neutral in that, hopefully what we're doing, if we make a good connection, are uh, understanding practice needs, understanding goals and dynamics within there. And like we spoke about earlier, with progressives that are kind of picked by the manufacturer or a discussion with the patient or a VR headset or those types of things. Um, those aren't choices that we try to make for people, but we want to make sure we have all those options open. And then once you've made a decision, this is who I am, this is the direction I'm going. Um, I know what my peers are doing, and we want to be able to support those things. Like I said, all of those are legitimate choices. So when we land on one, and some of it has to do with the talent level of the staff and the time that you have to spend and where you are and historically what the practice has done. But just support those decisions, right? Respect and support those decisions of the practice owner and the staff there and help them get there, right? And just work with them until you have it.
Yeah, I would say if there's one thing that people really want, your patients, consumers, they want to feel confident in their decisions. So this is something if you're listening to this, making sure that whatever you need to do, and there are a lot of resources out there that you're making sure the people on the front lines of the optical, especially, are trained and educated, continuously informed. There are a lot of resources out there. Three Rivers Optical, pay attention. Don't dive into a storage room when you see your rep coming in. Just at least take a few minutes, learn something from them. Because again, if I'm the patient walking in, if I'm the consumer, and you're asking me to spend more money on something like a lens upgrade, better technology, I need to feel very confident in my decision before I'm going to spend more money. And that's really on the training that goes into the optician, both from a clinical standpoint, but just from a communication and sales aspect too, making sure that you're giving them the feedback they need and not just understand the product and the technology, but be able to communicate that in a way that gets the buy-in of the patient. So I'm really glad, Phil, we took some time to share. If anyone doesn't know, Three Rivers Optical is our partner lab. So where would people find out more about the great work that you guys are doing over there at TRO?
Yeah, so we certainly have a website that they could visit, and there's a contact me section. Most of those things I see, they filter through me. So, and we have plenty of resources across the country and sales reps that then would get involved. But yeah, doing great things there. Significant investment over the last couple of years, both in technology and people, and excited to share with anybody that wants to reach out.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to email me as well, I can put you in touch with Phil or the right person because the feedback on Three Rivers has been great, and that's not we can't say that for a lot of labs out there, and especially in terms
Cool.
of the service, the quality. So the turnaround time, the customer service with Three Rivers has been phenomenal. So it's been a real pleasure working with you guys, and thanks for taking the time today. I think it's an interesting topic that even when I was in practice, I admittedly didn't stay on top of as well as I should have. So hope doctors took something from this. If nothing else, just a nudge to make sure that you're staying current and making sure that the people on your sales team out there in the optical are staying current as well.
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks for having me on. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Thank you, Phil. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.